Welcome. When people today speak of the Russian Revolution, they usually mean the events in October 1917 that culminated in the Russian Empire becoming the first communist state. But in fact, pretty much the whole of 1917 saw unrest and transformation across the Russian Empire. Some historians even speak of two revolutions, in which the more familiar October Revolution was preceded 8 months earlier by the February Revolution. In the background here was nearly 3 years of massive military losses in the Great War, followed by spiraling inflation, massive layoffs, food shortages, and widespread protests, culminating in February 1917 with the Russian Tsar Nicholas II abdicating the throne. Today, we'll unpack what then followed, a Russian Revolution that proved one of the most monumental events in the 20th century. Given later 20th century history, it might seem fitting that Karl Marx's book, Das Kapital, his major unfinished critique of capitalism, was first translated into Russian. And yet, for decades afterward, Marx's thought remained irrelevant in Russian culture. However, Das Kapital did influence Vladimir Lenin, who wrote his own history of Russian capitalism. Lenin went on to become the first Soviet head of state. But Russian Marxism also developed two distinctives that set it apart from Marx's own ideas. First, Karl Marx was in many ways a philosopher of history. He believed that history moved through set stages. In particular, he denied that an agricultural economy could become socialist. Rather, he held that socialism only followed industrialization. In this way of thinking, agricultural economies were at an earlier stage of historical and economic development. Industrial economies were at a later stage. Still later came communism itself. At the time of the Russian Revolution, Russia was heavily agrarian, with 75% of the population working as farmers. In fact, in 1913, Russia had become the world's leading grain exporter. From Marx's own standpoint, this was a country ready for industrialization, but not for revolution and certainly not for communism. However, Russian Marxists rejected this belief and pushed ahead with their own plans. The second difference between Marx and his Russian followers concerns anarchism. The later 19th century saw multiple anarchist groups engage in terrorist acts across the world. This included assassinations and attempted assassinations of political leaders, including in the United States, Germany, and Russia. In fact, Lenin's older brother, Alexander, had been involved in one such terrorist group, and he was executed in 1887 following a failed assassination attempt on Tsar Alexander III. Lenin spent time as an anarchist before turning to Marxism, and in the Russian Revolution, Lenin and his associates endorsed terrorism. Marxists across Europe intensely debated the use of terrorism from 1918 onward. Western Marxists, however, largely preferred parliamentary and democratic procedures. But Lenin and his associates saw terrorism as a strategic tool, and they not only defended their use of it, but also condemned the fact that Western Marxists largely rejected such tactics. These mutual recriminations led to a growing rift between Russian and Western European socialists, although this did not come to full fruition until the Cold War. At this point, it might be helpful to offer a couple of definitions. The first is Soviet. It just means council. Although often used politically, and although it could denote a broadly socialist politics, the word Soviet originally had no Marxist connotation. The same is true of our second word, Bolshevik. It just means majority, and it too originally had no socialist connotation. Lenin's use of Bolshevik was really just clever propaganda. These two words have become synonymous due to historical contingency, and every revolution is a theater of contingency. No one in February 1917 could have predicted how the Russian Revolution would conclude. But it needs to be stressed that, despite the outcome, communists did not begin the Russian Revolution. Those we now associate with early Soviet Russia, such as Vladimir Lenin, lived in exile in early 1917 and only returned to Russia later that year. By then, the provisional government created after the Tsar's resignation had entered dire straits. One important support for the provisional government was the Congress of Soviets, a collection of workers' and soldiers' councils. In a meeting that October, Vladimir Lenin, who had only just returned to Russia, called for overthrow of the provisional government. His was not a popular idea and was actually met with a walkout by most Soviet Congress members. And when elections were held several weeks later, it also became clear that most Russians disagreed with the Bolsheviks, who received only 25% of the vote. The most popular party was the Socialist Revolutionary Party, which received 40% of the popular vote. And so, as so often happens, revolution became civil war. The Bolsheviks were known as the Reds, their opponents as the Whites. The Reds ultimately won, and the Congress of Soviets rapidly became Bolshevik in its politics, and that is why the words Soviet and Bolshevik are now synonyms. Despite their victory in civil war, the Bolsheviks had to confront the fact that Russia was largely Christian. Russia had a state church, the Russian Orthodox Church, and its beliefs and practices not only shaped Russian culture, but touched upon the whole of life, from cradle to grave. Every major life event had some sort of service. When a child was born, it was baptized. Marriages were solemnized in church. Sickness was met with prayers for healing, and burial was done in church cemeteries. Beyond this, the Russian Orthodox Church played a decisive role in many services for society, ranging from orphanages and charitable aid to schools and organizations concerned with workers' rights. Church and state had long supported each other. For example, every new czar was anointed and prayed for by church leaders. Although the abdication of Nicholas II created an unstable situation for church-state relations, centuries of Russian Orthodox culture remained firmly part of Russian existence. But the Bolshevik takeover changed this situation. There have been many socialist groups since the 19th century, and their approaches to religion have varied, ranging from devout adherence to one or another religion, such as Christianity, to outright hostility. Marx was an atheist and a materialist. He described religion as the opiate of the masses. Still today, this remains one of his most famous statements. He looked upon religion as a form of false consciousness, that is, a form of wish fulfillment. The Bolsheviks gave this critique a militant application, attacking the Russian Orthodox Church. Holy books were banned, religious art was confiscated, religious buildings were secularized, that is, put to non-religious uses, and even destroyed. Bolshevism aimed to create a new Russian culture. And yet, despite this, Marxism has often been described as a secular religion. This critique really got going in the 20th century due to Bolshevism. But even in the earliest days of Marxism, we find that religious language was used quite intentionally. For example, in 1847, the year before the publication of the Communist Manifesto, Friedrich Engels composed his draft of a Communist Confession of Faith. You can see the religious dependence in the title. But Engels also used a question and answer format for the work. By Engels' time, this format had been widely used for centuries in Christian catechisms, works that taught the basics of belief and were written for both youth and new converts to the faith. And yet, despite this influence, Engels' Communist Confession of Faith concluded with the following question and answer. Question 22. Do communists reject existing religions? Answer. All religions which have existed hitherto were expressions of historical stages of development of individual peoples or groups of peoples. But communism is that stage of historical development which makes all existing religions superfluous and supersedes them. The communist confession of faith was patterned on religion. However, it didn't advocate the rejection of religion, but instead asserted that religion had already been surpassed. And yet, religious language continued to shape Marxist thought. Consider the Hungarian philosopher Georg Lukács. In 1919, he published an essay with the title, "What is Orthodox Marxism?" Orthodoxy means right belief, and it is yet another word often used with religion. Lukács explained, "It, that is Orthodox Marxism, is the scientific conviction that dialectical materialism is the road to truth, and that its methods can be developed, expanded, and deepened only along the lines laid by its founders." And he concluded, Marxist orthodoxy is no guardian of traditions. It is the eternally vigilant prophet proclaiming the relation between the tasks of the immediate present and the totality of the historical process. And the same fierce loyalty defined Bolshevik leadership. A good example comes from Leon Trotsky, an early Bolshevik revolutionary and party leader until he fell afoul of Joseph Stalin. In 1924, he said, "The party is always right. We can only be right with and by the party, for history has provided no other way of being in the right." And even after being forced into exile, he maintained his fervent belief, as he said in 1938, "Our party demands each of us, totally and completely. Let the Philistines hunt their own individuality in empty space. For a revolutionary to give himself entirely to the party signifies finding himself." Due to its borrowing from religion while claiming to surpass religion, both critics and more neutral observers have often considered that Marxism simply was religion, albeit of a secular sort. So what? And yet, it is also clear that the Bolsheviks simply could not escape the fact that the Russian Orthodox Church defined so very much of Russian culture. Perhaps surprisingly, despite being stridently atheistic, the Soviet Union adapted elements of traditional religious practice. The most well-known example is the scientific preservation of Lenin's body following his death in 1924. It was an old belief in the Russian Orthodox Church that after holy men and women died, their bodies did not decompose like normal bodies, and sometimes that such bodies did not decompose at all, but were miraculously preserved. This is actually an idea fairly widespread in Christianity. You also find it in Roman Catholicism and some forms of Protestantism. But what matters here is that the Soviets adapted this belief by embalming Lenin's body and placing it on public display. Reflecting the influence of Russian Orthodoxy, Lenin thus became a kind of Bolshevik saint. But the Bolsheviks did so with the express statement that his preservation was a product of science, not some sort of divine miracle. In other words, elements of religion were adapted to attack religion. But it didn't always work. For more than a decade after the October Revolution, Bolshevik soldiers traveled across Russia, opening the tombs of saints, hoping to show that, in fact, belief in saintly preservation was just superstition, the opiate of the masses in action. But, on the one hand, among a largely religious population, such desecration was widely resented. And this is not all. Sometimes, when saints' tombs were opened, their bodies were found decomposed. But, at other times, their bodies were found remarkably well preserved. The Bolshevik attack on religion was a damp squib. Nonetheless, as Soviet socialism spread outside of Russia, the Soviets often attacked the dominant religion in the area: Buddhism, Islam, Roman Catholicism, etc. But the end goal was always the same: to instantiate the Marxist criticism of religion. And as seen here, the critique of religion did not stand on its own. This editorial cartoon is entitled, "Comrade Lenin Cleans the World of Filth." The four figures signify Christian monarchy, of which there are two figures, the clergy of the Russian Orthodox Church, of which there is one figure, and capitalism, again with one figure. The Bolsheviks aimed not just to recreate Russia, but the wider world as well. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. First are two books in the series Very Short Introductions, published by Oxford University Press. First is The Russian Revolution, a very short introduction by S.A. Smith. Next is Communism, a very short introduction by Leslie Holmes. They work well together, especially because Smith offers a clear historical narrative, punctuated by statistical data, while Holmes's international overview is especially strong on communist civics. Next, for a more detailed study, read The Russian Revolution by Sheila Fitzpatrick. Beginning in the early 20th century, she carries the story up through the eve of World War II, thus engaging the great question of whether and when any revolution officially ends. And finally, for the broader sweep of revolution and later Soviet history, read Revolutionary Russia, 1891 to 1991, by Orlando Figes. Focusing heavily upon 1917, Figes then traces out the continuity of revolutionary ideals and thus justifications for continued revolutionary violence in later Soviet history. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.